it's helpful for me in terms of form to be able to listen and very precisely say, oh, this is just 3 seconds too short or 3 seconds too long. Even if some of it is MIDI and some of it is sound samples, it gives you a good idea of your timing. But it's a little bit dangerous in terms of balance issues. Is the thing that I'm still working on, because if you have the sound of a harp that's recorded super close at very high level, clearly when you're in a large hall with 13 musicians, you're not going to necessarily hear that. Yeah.
And the microtones in Logic, how do you go about it? Can you just adjust the frequency, or?
It's very time-consuming the way I work, and probably not the most efficient way. I work in open music a bit to get my harmonies to be able to listen to it. Sometimes I just sort of use my imagination and leave it at that, and then sometimes I actually transpose the sounds, or I have certain sound banks that have a certain number of quarter tones. So it depends how picky I am. If I really want to hear the sound with all the quarter tones, maybe I'll take the time to transpose them, but it clearly becomes time-consuming when you have the larger ensembles to work with. So that's just a bit of that. Then in terms of these sort of contrasting texture blocks that keep coming back, I sort of start simply and then work out in terms of the texture to create something more complicated. So I started with this idea of just pairs and duos. So flute and harp, oboe and trumpet, bassoon, cello, clarinet, violin. And I start just by composing that. I have sort of a general idea of the gesture. And then I start fleshing that out with the other instruments to create a more complicated sort of background texture to that. And perhaps you notice also that this piece is, even if it's quite active and it's moving around a lot, the harmonic rhythm is actually quite slow. So basically one texture is one orchestration, is one harmony, and that sort of stays constant for the chunk of time. And part of the reason I did that was because I wanted to play with memory when it comes back. I wanted something very distinct that would be easy to remember. So if you have the sound of the oboe and trumpet with this very busy kind of wind writing on one harmony, you recognize it hopefully when it comes back. And I think it works for a piece this length, 7.5 minutes, but I think that this could potentially be problematic if I tried to write a 20-minute piece where you always stick in one harmony for one section, because I think that you would lack a sense of development. But what else? Oh, I wanted to mention another thing that I was interested in exploring was the idea of having a hollow center. And this kind of relates a bit to the poetics of the piece, this idea of watching something very festive, but from afar, having this kind of hollow core. And I wanted to see structurally whether you could make a piece where the center of it was very empty, in fact, where orchestration is not a lot happening, where there's not as many pitches, so the chord is much more simple. So there's that sort of emptiness in the middle. Now, what time is it? I think I'll just talk 5 more minutes and then we can have time for questions. Again, a little bit more about the way in which I'm working. I think that also one thing I'm coming to realize is that, with composition, with teachers, they always say you have to try to find your voice, your compositional voice. And to me, I realized that was very closely related to how you work. Once you allow yourself to find your own way of working, then I found it easier to sort of find the music that I wanted to be writing, rather than sticking to a method that maybe my teachers use, but it's maybe not my own. And part of this has come because I'm quite interested in interdisciplinary projects, working with artists, working with dance, collaborating with people, and having, again, a sort of more playful approach to things. So this is a project I was working on in the fall. I don't know if it's really finished or successful, but it was really an interesting way to work. I was collaborating with a visual artist in New York, Julia Sherman, and she was interested in opera and sort of the slightly absurd element of opera where it's very theatrical and over the top. But there's these singers that are extremely well trained and have this huge control over their voice. And she was interested in the idea of the body as an instrument, something that's at once extremely powerful, that can create this huge sound without being amplified, but it's also very fragile. So, for example, it is a little bit absurd, the project, but what happens if you take a belt around the singer's waist and you start yanking it like this when she's singing, it affects her singing voice, and it shows how the body is a bit more fragile. And some of it is just in good humor. You see on the left a guy singing through a traffic cone. So some of it is a little bit goofy, but we were just playing around with these different sounds. But in some ways, I thought that this is a way to show sort of the variety of activities that sometimes go in when I'm working on a piece. So often there will be a stage where there's sort of abstract ideas, sketches, formal plans. I often meet with my musicians beforehand, as I think you had mentioned you do that as well, because I find that you can get a lot of energy and find new timbres that you wouldn't necessarily have found on your own. There's a certain element of improvisation, either on the piano, or sometimes I record my own voice just doing things to get an idea of the gestures I want. In this case, I met with each of the singers individually, and we did a recording session. And I'm kind of interested in this sort of feedback loop of material. So I had prepared a certain number of things where I would direct them and ask them to do different types of sounds. I would also play them sounds. They had headphones on. And I'd play them sounds that were not at all singing sounds, but get them to imitate it with their voice, which was really interesting. I found all kinds of material that I don't think I'd ever have come up with if I was just sitting at the desk. For example, I played them bird songs, I played them a deer bellowing, I played them, I don't know, have any of you seen Laughing Club? It's kind of a form of Indian yoga that's usually done by older people, and it's sort of these exercises to release tension that are really hilarious, so I got them to imitate that. So there's this whole variety of things, and in a way that was an interesting process, also just getting an opera singer to loosen up enough to, imitate a deer bellowing. It was kind of hilarious. And then from that, I go through a very detailed process of creating a library of sounds. So for example, this is just one singer, Charlotte. I have all these different categories of sounds. It's very time-consuming the way I work, but I find it actually is helpful, and then I would come up with a whole sort of selection of that. And then when I go to compose, I've got sort of this database of material. So then from that, I would do something like this, which again is in Logic. And I basically created a tape piece out of the sounds that I had recorded with them, which I could send to them and they could listen to. So here's a little bit from the beginning. Anyways, you get the idea. It's sort of, I mean, you have to imagine this is like a video sound installation piece, so there's a visual element. And then we proceeded from that level to do the actual videotape session for the musicians. And what I did was, it's kind of like karaoke. I would play, they had an earbud, and they would hear their track playing, and they would sing along to it. I also made a score for them to study, for just sort of to help them learn the piece. So it's kind of, it's sort of notated, a little bit graphical, but it's more as a memory aid than anything else because they're learning by ear. And then what we would do is record in very small segments. I thought that this was actually an interesting way to work. I don't know if it would work for my concert music, but it's surprising what they were able to do by ear in terms of imitating. I mean, you can't be as precise maybe as you would with a tape piece or something like that. But it's surprising that, within a week, I gave them the score a week before the recording session, that we were able to do it, but just by recording small little phrases at a time and then editing it together. So from this, oh, I didn't put it in the thing right. Then we created the video where everything was combined. I can sort of maybe put a little segment.
Yes.
Anyways, you can't see it. What's that?
It's for 3 screens, or it looks like?
Yeah. So it's set up on 3 different screens. Each one had a separate speaker. You can't see the image very well here, but she was sort of playing with these stereotypical opera characters. So the idea of the mad woman, the sort of patriarch father, and the castrato lover boy. Yeah, there was a certain degree of humor in this too, but we were just sort of playing around with these stereotypes. Anyways, I thought I'm not really sure what to make of this project yet because it was fairly recent, but I thought that it was maybe something to show a different way of thinking about composing, which I find to be really liberating, to not feel too tied down by necessarily like a very academic way of thinking. I think that's more or less what I wanted to say. I don't know if I have any questions or.
Would you consider this piece for like a trio of vocalists, concert piece?
I don't know.
Specialized?
Maybe, or maybe just as a tape piece even. I'm not sure how much the visual element helps. I feel actually, because it was kind of a rushed project, that if I were to have done it again, I would have wanted to push the visuals more, that they were like a little shy, and I don't know, maybe the idea of using the props, maybe we should have gone even further with it. But yeah, I guess it could be performed. I mean, Cogle's operas are kind of like that, you know. I mean, I'm not close to continuing working on something like this. It was just sort of an initial trial. This was for an open studio showing, so it wasn't in a gallery, but the visual arts students have a day where everything is open, different gallery owners and public and friends can come and view it. So it was sort of a casual presentation. Yeah, that's a good question.
Question about the first piece of work.
Yeah.
Those circles, are there actually circles? Are they actually
They're kind of moving their bow like this on the strings,
kind
which
of
is,
between this and that?
yeah, it's sort of shifting the timbre a bit. It kind of gets a bit of a wispy sound to it. Yeah. I don't know if it's an official technique, but we came up with that.
It depends on how much rosin you put in the bow as well.
That too. Yeah.
If you put too much rosin, it sticks too much. And
Yeah, that's
starts
true.
bouncing.
Yeah.
But they did a good job.
Yeah, I kind of, some of those things that, you try to notate as best as possible, and then hopefully you have enough rehearsal time where you can discuss with the performer what it is you're trying to get after.
Do you have this? Is this available to watch somewhere?
Oh, I have to post it to my website, but I couldn't. No. I'm not sure if they already posted it on video or YouTube yet. I could ask her. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Can you tell us how often you met with your collaborator, what your collaborator told you in terms of making musical suggestions, if she did any, if you gave video suggestions to her?
Yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time in contact via email, and then, yeah, we definitely met also in person to talk about the project. She had very specific ideas of, she wanted 3 singers, she wanted to be, she had the idea of sort of a dress rehearsal, so they have hair and makeup, but they're wearing casual clothes, and also the way that it's set up, and then I think also the way the music's composed, like there's parts where they're more aligned, but there's parts too where it's like they're doing warm-up sounds. And then, I mean, the music, she kind of let me do what I wanted. She wanted points where the different characters would sort of line up. And then the rest, yeah, and then she talked about this idea of using different objects or different props that would sort of have an effect on the voice. But then in terms of the actual makeup of the piece, I was free to do what I wanted. And then as for the visuals, I don't have much experience with that, so I gave a little bit of feedback, but I figured that was her department. I didn't want to be too picky about it. So yeah, but I'm sure it would change too the longer we know each other. We didn't actually know each other before this project, and so maybe it would be different if we had been friends for a long time. We'd have a different work relationship too.
Cool. Well,
Right,
thanks
thank
so
you
much. Well, thanks everybody for coming. Just as a reminder, the final